Sure. I think that that would be helpful to show preceding arguments from history that make the same points, especially about what I call two-tier typology and the nature of the subservient covenant or the old covenant subservient to the covenant of grace. And so, John Cameron in 1608, he defended many theses about his threefold covenant scheme or model in Heidelberg, and they were published in Latin, and then they were later translated and published in English. And Cameron, he proposed the three covenant model in terms of the covenant of nature with Adam, the subservient covenant with the Israelites, and the covenant of grace. But what one of the things that he did that was really important is in his discussion of typology among his theses, he said, this is Cameron speaking, he said, the sacrifices, sacraments, and ceremonies of the ancients had their carnal use over and besides the spiritual signification. There's your two levels. They have a carnal use. They do something for the flesh over and besides also having a spiritual signification. They point to something greater and other than themselves. And then he gives examples. He says, so circumcision primarily, again, I'm quoting him, did separate between the seed of Abraham and the rest of the nations. It did seal unto them the earthly promise. Secondarily, it did signify out sanctification. So he's saying, according to the flesh, circumcision marks an earthly people and says, Canaan belongs to you. Secondarily, he's saying it's pointing out an inward holiness. It's a symbol of inward holiness. He says, in like manner, the Passover primarily signifies the passing over of the destroying angel. Secondarily, Christ. So also the sacrifices and the cleansings, they represented primarily a certain carnal holiness. Secondarily, they figured out Christ and the benefits of the new covenant. So for John Cameron, he acknowledges two levels, a certain carnal use or a certain carnal holiness that is primary, and then secondarily pointing out Christ and the benefits of the new covenant. And this two-tier typology is why he looks at the old covenant, the Mosaic covenant specifically, and he calls it a subservient covenant. It provides different blessings from the new covenant or from the covenant of grace, but it subserves it. For Cameron, it revives the curse of the Adamic covenant in certain ways. It's not the Adamic covenant, but it makes it known again, and it prepares sinners. It points them. It pushes them to the covenant of grace and the benefits of Christ. But the two-tier typology is the main thing that I want to point out. The carnal use over and besides the spiritual signification. Now, this model was adopted by many of the Congregationalists, especially. So Samuel
Real,
Bolton, yeah, sorry, go
real
ahead.
quick, real quick before you jump in there, I want to note that the OPC report on republication does helpfully acknowledge that statement from Cameron. It does quote it, and it says, "Look, this is different from what's put forward in the Westminster Standards in terms of their whole model and understanding." So I was very thankful for that. Um, but I want to note that from our perspective, the OPC report on republication was very helpful. I think it's a great document. Read it through a few times. But it was helpful in clarifying that the subservient covenant view is contrary to the Westminster Standards, as well as some modern formulations of it by Presbyterians. I did not think that it sufficiently engaged the subservient covenant view biblically to determine which was correct. It did so sufficiently to show that it was not compatible with the Westminster Standards, but from our perspective, there's a ton that it did not touch on, it didn't address, and I don't feel that it adequately addresses our position.
Of course, it has a limited scope and purpose, but
Certainly, I just Dr. Wynn mentioned that it's not the end all be all on this discussion is my
sure.
point. It's very helpful. It has a place. It's very helpful, but there's more to be said and discussed.
So Cameron's view finds a home, especially among the Congregationalists. Bolton translated his theses and republished them in English, and Bolton just takes his view. Bolton follows Cameron, but I want to quote from Thomas Goodwin, who also names Cameron and follows his view of the subservient covenant and uses two-tier typology. So Cameron says that the Mosaic covenant was a subservient covenant to the gospel, and then he says, as learned Cameron calls it. And he goes on to say that the Mosaic covenant had was quote an outward covenant with the Jews, and he says that their ordinances, quote, besides their spiritual use in typifying things heavenly to spiritual believers then, they had an outward carnal use to the whole nation. So the entire nation of the Jews has an outward carnal use in the subservient old covenant. But then there are also spiritual believers among them, and these ordinances have a spiritual use typifying things heavenly. And you might say, well, what does that mean? Later, he says that the forgiveness provided by the sacrificial system was, quote, a forgiveness of reprieval, not to be destroyed for their sin. And then he says, quote, and so they had a sanctification and a justification which were not really such, that is, not of the heart and conscience. So when you use the sacrificial system, it will declare you, you are now just according to the law, and you are now holy according to the law. But he says, but that's not the sanctification and the justification that we have of the heart and the conscience through Jesus Christ and the new covenant, or the covenant of grace. So he's acknowledging the two levels, that the old covenant effected something different than what the new covenant effected, but they're related through typology. It's not that the blessings of the new covenant are absent, they're just distinct from the blessings of the old covenant. So Cameron and Goodwin, and of course, John Owen follows this model. Owen does not name Cameron. He does not say that he's following Cameron, but he very much expresses the same model. And Owen was discussed briefly by the Reformed Forum, and they do acknowledge that his view is different from what they believe. And I just want to point out that Owen makes this two-tier distinction. He says, for example, that all the Levitical services and ordinances were in themselves carnal, and had carnal ends assigned unto them, and had only an obscure representation of things spiritual and eternal. So the Levitical system is for the flesh, and it accomplishes things according to the flesh, but it is spiritually significant obscurely of eternal things. And then he also says there were some lines and shadows to represent the body, but the body itself was not there. There was something above them and beyond them which they reached not unto. The old covenant could not do what Jesus Christ did. And then another example of a Presbyterian, John Brinsley, who was a minister in the 17th century. Go ahead, Brandon.
Oh, no, just scratching.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Sorry.
John Brinsley was a Presbyterian, and I'm not saying that he followed Cameron's model. I'm not saying that he adopted Cameron's model. I'm just going to give an example of one who also acknowledged the two-tier nature of typology. And I have a really long quote, but I'm not going to read the whole thing because that would just be boring for people to listen to. But he's asking the question, how can the sacrifices make an atonement? How can the sacrifices expiate the people? How could they do this? And then he makes a distinction between a twofold guilt. There's a ceremonial guilt against the law, and then there is a moral guilt in the conscience. There's an outward guilt and an inward guilt. And he says that the sacrifices they expiated ceremonially. He says they extended only to a ceremonial and temporal expiation, and that only of some sins. But the sacrifice of Christ extends to a real eternal expiation, and that of all sins. So Brinsley is noting that the sacrifices are a type of Christ, but they effect and accomplish a different kind of forgiveness for different kinds of infractions. The law condemns this outward unholiness, this outward impurity, and the law provides sacrifices to restore that outward holiness and that outward purity. And this is what he comments on Hebrews chapter 9, Hebrews chapter 10, the statement, it is not possible that the blood of bulls and goats should take away sin. He says, yes, that's true. They could not take away the eternal guilt, but as far as external and temporal guilt, he says, it extended unto them. And so it's the same. That's what I want our Presbyterian brothers to acknowledge or deny, to affirm or deny. Did the sacrifices of the Old Testament remit sins outwardly, or remit outward sins, we might say? Was there a carnal use? Was there a carnal holiness? Was there carnal sins and carnal sacrifices?
Apart from saving faith in Christ.
Which are distinct in substance from
that
the
were
grace.
efficacious apart from saving faith in Christ, whether the participant had saving faith in Christ or not.
Correct. As Thomas Goodwin said, it was effective to all the Israelites, and then it had a spiritual significance above and beyond or beside its initial historical significance. That is what I want Presbyterian brethren to either affirm or deny. Did the Old Covenant offer a remission to all who participated in it rightly, according to the law, that is distinct in substance from the remission that Jesus Christ provides? Um, and well, I would love to hear them discuss that point more specifically, because I think that is where the agreement and the disagreement can be made more clear, is that the two-level nature of typology in the system. And then just one last quote from a particular Baptist named Philip Carey. He says, "We do indeed acknowledge the subserviency of the law to Christ and the covenant of grace. But it does not therefore follow that the law is a covenant of gospel grace. The law is not the gospel, nor the gospel the law. And therefore, though the one of them is plainly subservient to the other, yet they ought not to be mixed, blended, or confounded the one with the other, as if they were but one in the same covenant, and no difference to be made between them, except in respect of different degrees of the discovery of gospel grace, as has been suggested. A subserviency in anything to promote the ends of something else does not make it to be the thing itself, the ends whereof are promoted thereby." So the subservient covenant, as Samuel Bolton said, is the resolver to all these controversies. Bolton looked at Cameron's view and he said, this is the key to all of the debates, because the subservient covenant view acknowledges the old covenant is not the covenant of works, but it is a covenant of obedience. And it's not the covenant of grace, but it portrays and prepares one for the grace of Jesus Christ and his covenant. And that is the resolution to all of these questions, in my opinion. Did the animal blood remit sins or not? It did, but not in the way that Christ's blood did. Were the Old Testament saints saved by the grace of Christ? Yes, absolutely. But were there other blessings and benefits that they were all enjoying? You know, all of these questions are resolved by two-tier typology and a subservient covenant view. And I would love to see, and you were right, Brandon, that the Westminster Confession has already shut the door on this question. But I would like it to be more widely understood and recognized that covenant theology in the Reformed tradition is broader than the Westminster Confession, and that this subservient covenant view had plenty of proponents and people who received it and accepted it and thought it was good. The Presbyterians did tend to reject it quite explicitly, but the Congregationalists tended to embrace it quite explicitly. And I think that it needs, one of the reasons is not only to understand the historical theology, but because perhaps this is perception. At times, I feel like we're being painted as this is a Baptist position. This is the way that Baptists think. Whereas we're speaking for myself, I'm very self-consciously following Cameron and Bolton and Goodwin and Burroughs and Owen and the particular Baptists who followed the same kind of argumentation, because I think it is faithful to the biblical data, and that it is wise, and it does indeed resolve many of these controversies. So I'd love to see our brothers affirm or deny two-tier typology. I think two-tier typology can even coexist with Voss's triangle. We don't have time to go into that, but I wouldn't even reject it, other than to say you need to reevaluate point B on the triangle, the nature of the type. Is it the heaven reality itself, or is it a picture of the heavenly reality through what it is in itself, etc.? Again, we'd love to chase that rabbit, but we don't have time to do it. So that's where I see a beneficial conversation happening, is about two-tier typology, the nature of the benefits of the old covenant in relation to the benefits of the new covenant. Are they the same benefits, or are they distinct benefits? And whether this is helpful for moving forward, I believe it will be.